Welcome back to another episode of Radical Narrative. I am your host, Maiwand Tutusis, coming at you from Treaty 6 territory up here in the Northern Prairie in the middle of Canada. It's late January. I'm bringing you an episode that we recorded last month. Things have been crazy, still playing catch up. In this episode, I am sitting down with my close friend Lema, who was also on a previous podcast a number of years ago. Today, we're going to be having a conversation about her family experience as being an Afghan woman in the diaspora, and a little bit of family history coming out of Afghanistan. In particular, what's unique about Lema is that the political takes and perspective that emerge from her life experience. So we really narrowed that conversation down. And again, she has an amazing relationship with her father. I got to meet him. Pretty cool guy. Admire that relationship and dynamic, especially for me being a father. It was great to finally get this conversation recorded, and I'm looking forward to future conversations that emerge from this episode, and obviously, again, fostering those brain gains for everybody out there who subscribes and likes and shares this podcast. I want to give a quick shout out to our Patreon subscribers who have been donating to us monthly. I really appreciate that, and you are keeping us financially afloat and also keeping us motivated. I want to give a shout out to all our new followers on social media who have been following us. That's awesome. That's great. And again, we're going to be bringing you more episodes as things settle down in life. It's been pretty crazy. It's been pretty wild. Obviously, work and family is taking priority since this is a hobby project. But again, thank you for your patience. We do have some more episodes coming down the pipeline in coming weeks, so be sure to watch out for those. I don't want to keep you too long, so here's my conversation with Lema, grounded reflections on politics, worldview, and life. Like, subscribe, and share, and as always, be sure to stay tuned and listen in. Awesome, let's get into it. Welcome back, Lema. Super excited to have you. Longtime friend, I guess. You actually were out here visiting over the summer, and that was great. That was amazing. And we didn't get a chance to record then, but we do get to record now. So go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. That visit was such a blast. Me and Nadia still talk about all the fun times. It was her first time on the prairie, so she was really excited to be there. I'm Lema and a good friend of Maiwand's, and I'm always really unsure about what to say in this part. I really struggle with talking about myself in general, because there's so many components to it, but also I'm not really sure what kind of highlights people want to hear. But I'm an Afghan woman who, I guess, has been displaced several times and lives in the diaspora, originally from Afghanistan. Spent quite a bit of my formative years in Pakistan as a child, and then we relocated to Canada when I was 9. With my family, and been here since then. Mainly kind of lived around Ontario, did my schooling there, work in Ontario and around the country, and make amazing connections through my line of work, both professionally, but also the community organizing that I've been fortunate enough to indulge in and participate in. And that's how I met folks like you and other folks as well. So it's a little bit about me and where I come from, and a little bit about what I do.
Awesome. Yeah, I really like it. And I really appreciate you wanting to be on the podcast, because you have so much information to share and unique insight, and especially about where you come from, your upbringing, and who you are as a person, obviously. But I really want to give our listeners a sense of your heritage. I know it's kind of taboo in some circles, but for Native people, Indigenous people, we love we love to know who people are. We want to know who's in our territory. And I know some people kind of get turned off by that, but I openly defend no, we have every right to know and ask who people are. So yeah, give us some heritage, some background, what's your family heritage and where you come from in that sense in terms of kinship and land.
Sure. Yeah, I love speaking about where I'm from. The only time I'm worried about is if I don't know anybody very well, and if I'm not, I guess better framing it, if I'm not sure what their intentions are. Some people sometimes usurp heritage and who they're connected to get places, but in general, I love speaking about where I'm from. And my heritage in terms of where I come from, as I mentioned, I'm Afghan, so both my parents are from Afghanistan. I'm from there as well. My dad's side is from Kandahar originally. That's his hometown, so he's Pashtun ethnically. my mom is ethnically Baloch on her dad's side. We're a patrilineal society, but her hometown is Kabul, which is the capital. And so she, interestingly, grew up at a time where there was rapid development under King Zahir Shah during her dad's time. And then the Republic in Afghanistan. So the capital was kind of the hub of major political activities, formally so. And she was the one who saw, I guess, reaped the most rewards infrastructurally around development. And my dad, very different story, grew up in like even though he lived in the city, came from a very working class family on my dad's side. So he had very humble roots. And yeah, I have no idea how they met. I'm kidding. They met when my dad moved to Kabul for university, and he could have chosen to stay in Kandahar, but he wanted to go to medical school, and for that he had to move. So he had never spoken Farsi, was not familiar with it, had to learn it from scratch. Like when he was entering university, did all his schooling there. And yeah, my mom met my mom there. So my dad was a doctor and physician. My mom was an environmentalist engineer. Things way beyond my brain, and none of the kind of STEM genetics were passed down to me. So anyway, a miss on that front, but
no, you're a genius. You really are a genius. But you're highlighting, like, I guess, a bit more depth to being Afghan, right? That there's context and there's heritage here.
Yeah, that's my heritage. So I'm Pashtun in terms of patrilineal heritage, but I have Baloch roots as well. And I speak Pashto and Farsi, and I'm very lucky to do that. And very lucky that my parents were able to teach both languages to me, and I can read and write in it, which is a huge blessing, being able to live in the West and still do that. And I'm very connected to my family, my elders, my language, my community. I don't know if you've heard, I'm sure you have a very diverse group of friends, of people kind of half in, half out when they're in the diaspora, half foot, I guess 1 foot in one world and 1 foot in the other. And in my mind, both of my feet have always been just rooted back home. And physically, I am here, but mentally, just not here most of the time. But yeah, I'm very proud of where I come from, and do as much as I can to learn about our history, which is extensive and dates back thousands of years, and modern history and modern political developments, just for my understanding and my family's understanding, and kind of figuring out why the dynamics exist in my family, in our household, and in our, I guess, general society as a people. It's very important and directly linked to the political developments and historical developments, but also to that of the global South in general and other parts of the world that have experienced and continue to experience imperialist sabotage or neo-colonial sabotage. So yeah, it's all connected, which is why I have an avid interest in the history of other peoples and countries as well. So yeah, a little bit more heritage on that front. And
yeah, that's awesome. That's really awesome, because you're painting a picture for some of our listeners who may not have like a relationship to Afghanistan in general, like no understanding, right? Because obviously, like in North America, imperial core vibes, Canada, United States, there is this picture that's painted and fed to us throughout, the media, and also through, I guess, like, the what is it, the war on terror that Canada got involved in and all that stuff. Because honestly, I remember 2001, and I specifically remember, so I've always been a book nerd, so I've always loved encyclopedias as a kid.
Middle child vibes.
Yeah, going off and looking at the encyclopedia. And I remember looking at pictures of Afghanistan. I remember seeing it and having like this comprehension, right? So me being a nerd kid, always having like the factoids, right? So I remember like in 2001, obviously September 11th, and all this conversation about Afghanistan and this stuff coming up, and natives just jumping on board with it in some cases. Not everybody, obviously, and people being critical. But I remember like, no, like there's something really wrong with the world. And it was all because I had an encyclopedia. And I remember seeing it in the A encyclopedia. So yeah, you are painting this picture to listeners who may not have any relationship, or may not have a comprehensive understanding of your part of the world and where you're coming from. Yeah. So, and also at the same time, you're really like bold in saying that you are still rooted and firmly planted there in your mind and living in the diaspora, but at the same time, not compromising in terms of who you are and where you come from, which I love. Like, I love to hear it.
Yeah. Well, it's a bit of a, I think it's a difficult and sensitive topic, right? And I think it's very personal. On the front that you're speaking around Indigenous peoples first interacting with Afghanistan, like that doesn't surprise me, and I have a lot of like empathy and understanding in that sense. That's your first point of contact with a country that's half a world away, right? And if that's your first sort of understanding of it, and it's such an overt and like on such a global scale, it's not a conflict that's limited there and you just hear about it on the news, is something that impact wise was very global, right? So I can definitely understand why that picture and that perception would be rooted, because what else do you hear, right? So even folks who may be critical, and sometimes it's difficult to get facts, and particularly around Afghanistan, there's there's a whole industry dating back to the 70s, academic and in terms of international organizations, some of the most trusted and well-reputed ones who've cultivated a lot of lies and misinformation. And even if, had resources or wanted to know more, it would be very, very, very difficult to get an accurate picture. And I say that with a lot of empathy, because it's something we struggle with as a people. We're very divided around our own history. So how can you expect to have that level of comprehension and understanding from others? So I can understand why people have that perspective. So a lot of empathy for people in that regard, and who do the work and actively ask questions. And I know sometimes people get uncomfortable and don't want to answer questions, but I really appreciate when people are like, well, what does this mean? And I thought this was this way. Like, that's how you open a conversation. And I'm very open to it.
Yeah, you are. And we have had conversations about this via texting and online. And it is a very delicate conversation, I guess, in terms of identity and people's relationship to place. How do you approach it? Like, how do you approach this conversation, given the history, given the reality you lived?
In terms of identity, it's such a sensitive topic, and really want to be mindful and approach with a lot of compassion for people who struggle with that. And for me, it was a very active decision I made as like a young child. I have like a very clear memory of like where I was and when in my brain, where I was mentally, and like what time of the year it was and what year it was, where I was like, well, I need to work harder for language retention. And it's not something that you can, well, you have so many priorities growing up. You're struggling with so many different things. You're struggling with poverty, you're struggling with identity, you're struggling with keeping your family together depending on who you are, and like there's so much going on. And quite frankly, some people don't have that connection. If it's I'm a first generation immigrant, so it's very different. If you're someone who's second and third and may have like direct roots but have never had any interaction with people in communities, and it's either diluted and it's not there, then it's really difficult, right? And what are you supposed to do? Go off of a like romanticized picture of where you come from? That's difficult too. So I'm very unapologetic about it, but I've had a lot of direct contact. Like my first 10 years of life, 9 years of life were in between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Like I have roots I can go back to. A lot of people don't have that. And have it even less these days. So it's hard. But thank you for saying that. I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, and I also want to one of the reasons why we really hit home positionality on the podcast too is because we are in an era on the Indigenous side of things here in North America where people are pretending, right? Like there's pretendians and people making things up. And I even, like how you said, some people will say things to advance their careers or advance their image for certain things. Mm-hmm. So we try to avoid that with these like core introductory questions that every guest gets to speak about who they are, where they come from. And so it's like you're setting the bar and you're setting the tone to speak to it. So I appreciate that in terms of like the radical narrative standard.
No, for sure. I mean, I'm very open to sharing with you because of our friendship and that between like us and your family. And I know the kind of people you're connected to and the people who listen to this. I'm very open. Yeah, most things I'm very open with. It's only when I feel like institutionally, if people use where I come from to paint a certain image, is when I get very wary and I'm very protective. But this is not that situation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm doing my best. I get nervous though. I do get nervous.
Don't be.
Okay.
You're doing so good.
I won't get nervous right now.
Yeah, you and my dad, both of you
Yeah.
just looking at each other, and I'm like, this is
Yeah.
Mylan, Baba. This
Yeah, for our listeners, I just met Lema's Baba right before we recorded, and we were both waving at each other, both nervous and didn't get to talk too much. But yeah, we'll talk about that on the episode because I want to bring him up because he's been really influential, as you say on our previous episode, in terms of how he raised you. So we will talk about that. But I want you to paint a picture of your relationship to your homelands and your territories from your perspective. So give our listeners and people who are listening to this podcast and interacting with you for the first time, interacting with your lands and territories for the first time, give them the picture from your mind, from your experience. How do you want people to see your lands, your territories, and where you come from?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always very careful not to romanticize things, but for me and my perception and from my experiences and um, both in the past and present, it's a place that's inherently rooted in kinship and nurturing and a community in this whole sense of it. It's a supremely diverse country in the modern borders of Afghanistan in terms of ethnic composition and linguistic compositions. There's over a dozen ethnic groups and languages that go with that. So yeah, there have been some strife and issues with that, and there still are. But inherently, it's a place where we have a very strong national identity and a very strong sense of patriotism towards our homeland, and very strong sense of justice. Sometimes maybe bordering on retribution for all the wrongs that have been done, in the most human way. We have a lot of compassion and empathy for our suffering, and it's something we hold close and near and dear to our hearts. Not as a way of commemoration because, well, a part of it, but also because we're actively living it and it continues to impact who we are. But we're very loving, very boisterous, very vivacious group of people, and that has its pitfalls, shortcomings, but also a lot of life to it. And it's a beautiful place. And I've only been able to visit my dad's hometown, Kandar, and have a meet family there when I was 5 or 6. So it's been a while, long time. And after that, it was almost impossible to go because of the occupation. And recently, it's just more possible to potentially go and be there. But I would love to see my mom's hometown, Kabul. But there's so many beautiful places, very diverse geography in the south, in the east, in the west, and then the north. And yeah, it's one of the most I think critical sort of flashpoints of history and politics in the past century, and will continue to be because of its role in the region, even actually dating past a century, since the 19th century, and the role that Afghanistan played in the game called and sort of like this play called the Great Game between the British Empire and at that time Tsarist Imperial Russian Empire, and then in the 20th century, and then now, very interesting positioning politically. But yeah, that's my home in a nutshell.
Yeah, and then one of the most common, like I feel like Western narratives around Afghanistan is that Alexander the Great made his way there, right? Like the Greek conqueror made his way east and was there.
He did.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
So that's an like interesting topic because the moniker that people give Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, and that really leans into the romanticism that's not very accurate. And we can get into that a little bit, but yeah, Alexander the Great was definitely there, and he did thrive. He wasn't massacred in any way. He was able to put roots of his territorial expansion in Afghanistan, and there's a region called Nuristan in the east, which has like descendants of his army and his people who live there. And that's the thing with a country and a region that has a history dating back thousands. There's so much intermingling and people coming and going that what he did do was write extensively about Afghanistan and the tenacity and capacity of its people in resisting things they don't want to agree to. Now, we haven't always been on the right side of history in any means. You could ask a lot of our South Asian neighbors in that regard. I think India in particular has very strong memories of invading Afghan armies. But yeah, you can always say like we're tenacious in that regard. And it's interesting, the graveyard of the empire's moniker is definitely like overhyped and romanticized, and people will loop in the Soviets in that regard too in the 80s, which is just inaccurate. And we can get into that as well, but it's romanticizing something that didn't exist. We've been on the losses side of things and on the winner side of things, and sometimes our territories have expanded, sometimes we were under subjugation for a very long time. But you were right, so don't edit that part out.
Yeah, another factoid.
Because you're not wrong.
Yeah. I might edit it to make me sound a bit smarter, but no, I'm just kidding.
Middle child vibes. Very much so.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, I think that I do remember like hearing that or maybe seeing it somewhere, and I wanted to verify that. But then at the same time, it does make sense how you're saying it is a moniker that I think really does a disservice to your people in your lands and territories, because you could flip it, right? It could be like a place of where, these people flourish, and you're highlighting all this like multiculturalism, this diversity. And that's not a graveyard. It doesn't sound like a graveyard at all.
No, it's not. And we're not a monolith. There's so much diversity, and that has come obviously through conflicts, through imperial expansions, and through forced and violent expansion. So I never want to paint this picture that we've always been like this perfect people and had these horrible things done to us, which is part of the story. But on the flip side, there was a lot of redrawing of borders before the Westphalian sense of like nation states and that means arriving imperial armies and receding ones, and just got to be mindful of how diverse how a country with diverse like ethnic groups come about. Not always pretty.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess we're speaking around to the reality that there has been very real injustice. There has been a history of colonialism, imperialism, ongoing imperialism taking place in your homelands and in your territory. So can you speak to your personal relationship then to colonialism? Because I feel like, indigenous people, BIPOC people who have been impacted by colonization, imperialism globally, it is sort of like a common ground that we tend to achieve in friendship and conversations. Like I feel like a lot of our conversations were around the fact that, we both have a history of colonialism in our family systems and oppression in our family systems.
Yeah, and I think there's so much commonality and just foundational points of relatability. It's why I'm in the line of work I do and connect with the people I do, is because it's an inherent sort of sense of understanding around similar dynamics, maybe not the exact same situations, but similar dynamics and relationships, and around neocolonialism and imperialism, and that looks very different in very different parts of the world, but inherently same sort of set of actors, and maybe the exact same people sometimes, and states sometimes, but I'm talking about on the side of capital and who controls resources and who has leverage over resource monopoly. So the inherent, as I kind of learn more and continue to learn more over the years, and we can get on the theoretical part of it a little bit, is that under the system of capitalism, it's always the same actor. It just looks a little bit different, who have a foundational control over resources, modes of production, relation of productions, and then who on the flip side is the class that's not only upholding that dynamic, but also suffering the most and are subjugated the most. So
yeah, and then also the reality that we're always learning. Like there's always new thought processes as we grow and evolve, right? And that's one of the reasons I wanted you on here, was to speak to like informing us on your perspective in terms of how you're viewing, the very real problems we're facing from obviously like a leftist perspective.
It's interesting you say that, because when we're talking about like our first episode 2 years ago, I listened to it like maybe at this point 3 months ago, and I was like, I would say things so differently now. I can't believe like I said that.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting that even in the short 2.5 years, things have been very different in the past little bit, but that I would frame things even differently. But in terms of relatability, that's a huge common point of understanding, but also working together, and all part of the struggle of having a unified working class, right? Unified class of people. And that's where like maybe divergences come in around how you philosophically and theoretically place yourself.
Yeah.
Generally, I'm talking about everybody, and you might not see it from one perspective, but for me, it's inherently class-based, based on the methods of historical materialism, and obviously whatever you subscribe to and what kind of lens you use to look at things. And you can start at a certain point and get to a certain point and have different understandings, but that's sort of the approach that I take when I look at different sets of topics and histories. And it all clicks to me because people will often say like socialism is a science, right? It's perfected to a T through theory, calling it scientific socialism. And historical materialism and dialectics are like the tools you use to analyze. You can put that, I'm going to use it as like what's that thing? A magnifying glass. I'm going to illustrate it as that and kind of pinpoint any part of the world at any point in time. And you will find that the basis of Marxism and communism and socialism, whatever, and we can get into those labels in a little bit.
Yeah.
But the inherent sort of roots of how you look at things through class make sense. And how different actors on the side of oppressors, being the oppressor, and those subjugated, almost in a very cyclical way, experience the same things.
Yeah, and one important thing to highlight is that there's unique perspectives. Like this is a spectrum, right? It's not just Marxism, it's not just communism, straightforward. Like there is a conversation that takes place and subtleties in the conversation. And I think that's something really important to highlight because I personally don't want to like burn bridges with those people who subscribe to the thought processes around communism, Marxism, but I also don't want to like become so rigid or deal with people who are so rigid. And honestly, like we're in an era where Indigenous people are adding to the theory and building off the theory, and that's partly why I wanted you on here too, was to lay the groundwork for part of our learning process around Marxism, communism, socialism, and leftist thought. And also in particular, you have a really unique relationship with your father who lived the experiences of coming to like a realization of, the political spectrum, the theory, the conversations that do exist in real time. So I wanted to ask you questions about that because you did mention him in our first episode a couple of years ago, where you did talk about how he was influential in your political education, and how he raised you. And for me as a father, that really struck a chord with me because, and I did tell you this because I'm helping raise two daughters, right? Co-parenting with their mom now, and it's like, how do I raise these like these badasses that could speak to the political world and speak to oppression and have a really good, strong political backbone, which I feel you do have. But yeah, tell us about that, the relationship with your father, the political background that you're coming from, because it is a very unique experience that you have.
Yeah, you're doing it, Mylan. You're both doing it. You're loving them, and that's literally all you can do. You're giving them that space and platform to be who they are, and they'll watch and learn from people around them. And, like, their parents, their family are the first point of contact. So you don't have nothing to worry about.
Yeah, well, thank you. Like, it does mean a lot. It does mean a lot because the world's wild, right? The world's really wild. And it is like a self-conversation I have with myself constantly. How do we raise, children in a very chaotic and still a colonial world?
I feel like every Baba inherently has the ability to do that for them. But about my dad, he's awesome. I don't know. Sometimes there aren't enough words that I can think of to encapsulate everything that he is and has been, not only for me and my family, but for people in our community. And he's incredible. So I delved into a little bit of his home life earlier, but he comes from a very interesting family. So a very humble. We're very poor on my dad's side. When he was younger, he's one of 10, 11 kids, 10 brothers, one sister, born to very young parents. My grandparents were struggling, to raise a family that big. Not that big families were an anomaly by any means, but it's a lot of mouths to feed. So it's something that a lot of the principles that he instilled in us alongside my mom or things that were taught to him by my grandfather, whom I never met. He passed away before I was born. My dad always mentions things that he would say, like, my grandfather would say, like, the qalam, the pen, is your strongest sort of resource. It has the power to completely transform your life. And that's something my grandfather inherently believed in. He was a poet, he's a writer, he was a clerk, working in different parts of Kandahar at different levels of government. So education and knowledge is something he revered, very, very, looked at it very fondly, and made it a mission in his life to instill that in all his children as well, to varying success, because people have minds of their own and trajectories and their own paths. But it's something that many of my uncles and my dad took to heart.
Yeah, for sure. I really like that, like the aspect of the pen and its importance. What's the characteristic of your father for our listeners who obviously don't know him?
My dad would say he was like a very rambunctious child, very mischievous. I think you can see that in some of the stuff I share with you. He's like very playful.
Mm-hmm.
But when he was growing up older, he knew that for him, like, the pen had all the sort of powers and had the ability to take him from one reality to another, and it did. For him studying medicine, and for some of my other uncles as well, whom I never met, two of my older uncles who passed away long before I was born, were also doctors and like lawyers and other professions. Mm-hmm. And it's something that my grandfather instilled in him, and he instilled in us.
Yeah. Does like instilling that, does that mean like necessarily like an education or like a formal education?
It's not necessarily like you have to go to school, you have to get a degree, blah, blah, blah. There's a bit of that, and substantially part of that. And it's because that's the only way out of abject poverty. Like in our homeland, if you don't have land, if you're not a landowner, if you're not wealthy, if you don't have connections, you have very limited options. You either work on the land, not as a landowner, you just till the land on behalf of someone else, or you have very menial tasks, or you're a merchant. Not the rich kind. You work for someone else, or you go to school and you get into professions that give you a livable wage. That's why that trope of you're either a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer is because those were your kind of your options. Otherwise, life could be very difficult if you're not inheriting wealth or you're not a landowner. So it's something he instilled in us, and it was really the desire to know more. My dad always says, like, the more you know, the more informed you are. As the most informed person in the room, the more you have to work with, not only in terms of being always right, it's part of it, but also you can connect with people more. You have a better understanding of where they're coming from, and you can have more empathy and connect with them on that level as someone who's also an Afghan or maybe part of your community. And if they're not part of your community, you have a point of commonality with them, right?
I like it. And then also, what's unique about the conversations we had is that your dad had a lot of political engagement and political activities growing up.
Yeah. So in terms of his political activities, he was very influenced by things happening when he was an adolescent and a child. And at that time, when he was a child, it was the reign of King Zahir Shah, so a monarchy. And then the monarchy was abolished, and then there was a republic. And then in 1978, there was the coup, the Saud Revolution by the PDPA, People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. A lot of contention about that and the way it was carried out. But then from 1979 to about 1992-ish, it was a Democratic Republic of Afghanistan under the governance of the PDPA, and then later Watan Party, and Watan means country. So he was very much, and my mom, everybody in that generation were kind of embroiled by that. Everyone was very politicized. You didn't really have an option to be like, whatever, like, it's just party politics. I'll just go on about my day. It substantially at the core changed their lives, not necessarily in the best way, but my dad was very influenced by those developments. And he had older brothers who were fond of the PDPA and saw the merit in a lot of the policies, and not only theoretical principles, but then a lot of the infrastructural benefits and socioeconomic benefits that the PDPA and Democratic Republic of Afghanistan brought to Afghanistan during the 80s. So they were very much influenced by that. And my dad, as being super young in his 9, 10, and then teen years and early 20s, saw the merit of the party as well. So never really like a formal member of the party, but very much sympathized with him, was in the youth cadres, would learn all the theories and theoretical like basis of work that the party put forward, very much influenced in that. And then when you get to like late 80s, early 90s, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the onset of the civil war in Afghanistan and the fall of Kabul in 92 is when you have the mass exodus of Afghans to neighboring countries. It had been like that maybe since not 70s, definitely not 70s, mid 80s or late 80s, but much more so when the different warring factions, all part of the Mujahideen, were battling for control over governance in Kabul, and the capital was completely demolished, like reduced to rubble, and everybody was trying to get out. You left everything back home. You left everything behind. You were only able to take the clothes on your back, maybe a backpack or two, and your kids, and try to get transportation out of the country. So, at that point, he didn't really have the luxury of being politically involved, and even prior to that, like when he was studying medicine, he was somewhat involved in party activities on campus, but then he had to make a living. So he had a clinic, and then conscription came in the Afghan army to try to subjugate the Mujahid insurgency, being supported by the United States, Pakistan, CIA, the Saudis, the whole gang back in the day. So he was an army doctor, and he was posted in different parts of the country on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. But then after 1992, when everybody kind of had to flee for different reasons and largely to protect themselves and find a new place to live, he was solely devoted to like raising his family and doing the best he could in a new country where he didn't speak the language. We were undocumented refugees and had to navigate that, and then found enough means through the United Nations and their sort of support systems for migrants called the International Organization of Migrants, IOM, to help submit a bid to find refuge in Canada. And yeah, that was kind of his trajectory to find a different way out.
Yeah, so what was the main driver, you would say, was for that decision to go that route?
My dad's stress for and concern about his young kids and their inability potentially, like we were in school, obviously we were enrolled. Actually, we were enrolled in, I think I told you this, in British private schools.
Yeah.
Which is where I learned English. Yeah, but I think there was at that time in the early 2000s, there was limitations to how far you were able to enroll as a refugee, even if you had money or like had the means to continue funding that education. Like there was hard stop limitations around what kind of schooling you had access to, what kind of jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So he was thinking long term, and he was like, I can't stay here. So this was like mid 2000s. So Afghanistan was under occupation. It was kind of precarious. A lot of people went back home, but you never really knew what the next year would bring, because there was an active insurgency by the Taliban against the US led occupation. So he's like, well, that's not an option. So he was trying day and night to get somewhere, mainly Europe or North America. And I think at that time, Canada had the least stringent requirements for people. And we were a young family. So yeah, we made it here. But that's his kind of trajectory in terms of politics. And on a more personal level, yeah, he's always just been very encouraging for us to be exploratory of things around us and learn as much as we can and try to share as much as we can. He shares an insane amount of information, both personal and political, and around our family dynamics with us, so we understand. He was both of my parents, really big on language retention. Both of my parents. So with my mom, I speak Farsi. And it's interesting, my mom and my dad speak Farsi to each other, which is her native tongue. She speaks Pashto, but like her native tongue is Farsi. And my dad's native tongue is Pashto, and he speaks Farsi very well. But for us, he knows how much influence like the mother tongue has, and it's kind of the language you relay back to automatically. Like you will always learn it. You will always have an option to learn it if you're around with your parents and live with a family system that way. And he was trying to beat the odds of teaching us Pashto. So his method of teaching it to us as best as he could was that he would only speak to us in Pashto. And if we responded to him in any other language, forget English, like Farsi, Urdu, any other language, he just wouldn't respond back. He would pretend he didn't understand what we were saying. So the only way to communicate with him was to speak in Pashto. And still, even now, like, it's so funny. If let's say I'm in an argument with my parents, or I'm in a very like heated discussion, I'll turn to my mom, speak one language, turn to my dad, speak another. And it's like, people are like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm talking to them. What do you mean? I'm talking to them. And they're like, I think he's just switching languages back and forth for the fun of it. It's like, no, he literally won't talk to me if I don't speak in Pashto. So both of my parents have been really dedicated to knowledge. They understand the merits and have lived the merits of not only higher education, but higher knowledge. I come from a lineage of people who, like both my grandfathers, I talked a little bit about my dad's dad, but also my mom's father was a writer, a poet, and he was the vice president of Radio Afghanistan, later named Radio Kabul, in the early 60s, late 50s to early 60s. So he was very politically involved. And then my uncle, who passed away a year and a bit ago, was also very politically involved. So it's always been kind of inherent in our family. But my dad has always been because we're so similar, he's been very open and transparent about everything under the sun, politics, family dynamics, and why sometimes things are the way they are. He's always been the person I go to for any point of reference. And then I do my own work, and I wouldn't say like we see eye to eye on everything, maybe just like 99% of things, but we have our own divergences. But I love that I can learn from him. And more so over the years, he's like, I learned from you, which is lovely to hear that from you, Dad. But it's been
that's cool.
Yeah, he's the best. I don't know what else to say. He's awesome. And he's hilarious.
You're really laying out like your family lineage, your kinship systems, and the relationship to your homelands here. And one thing I like and I admire is that the political discourse and thought process is emerging from the lived experience of who you are and where you come from in terms of your father and even on your mother's side too, and how education is a key element in all this, that the ability to learn, the ability to, obtain an education in whichever form is very vital, right? And then I know you jokingly said that, there's moments where we will be right because we know information, and that's really valuable too. And all this emerged from you talking about your baba and your dad.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and one of the cool things he said too before we jumped on together when we were on Zoom together, he said that he's also learning from you now, that he's learning from what you're gaining in your knowledge. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and I think it's really cool because I feel like I also want to start honing in on, in general, like from a social kinship perspective, like narratives of fathers, people who have healthy fathers or politically driven fathers. Because I feel like society right now, there is a lot of commentary around fatherhood as being negative or toxic in some cases. And of course, there obviously is some situations out there, but I feel like not too many people are talking too much about fatherhood in a way that is loving and compassionate and has these narratives on the forefront, because sometimes, the negative stuff gets on the forefront. So I wanted to make space for that conversation.
We could talk about him forever, but he's very special.
Yeah, a whole nother episode. Lots of history there and lots of experience with your family in terms of like the political spectrums that exist, the political consciousness that's been fostered over the generations, very real. Mm-hmm. And I want to bring this back and hone it to you now, like your politics and what you believe in. And I guess I'll ask you that question straight up, is like what do you believe in and what are your politics?
Straight up. It's an interesting question. It's not a difficult question, but I think it's difficult to frame.
And we talked about this, right? We
did. We did do a prelude. So I like to think that my political positionality is always evolving. I'm always learning so many different things, and always continuing to learn about different things. But in a nutshell, I guess if I were to label myself, I'm a Marxist-Leninist in terms of hardcore theory, and people might have not, I don't think people listening to your podcast, but other people might have issues with that. And in very general terms, a socialist. And as I mentioned, believe in the science of scientific socialism and historical materialism. And that's how I approach almost everything in life that's related to politics and history. It's something that makes sense and has a historical and theoretical basis. So it's something that I've been learning about quite a bit over the past few years and applies very stringently to the developments of my homeland. And as I learned later on through the years, to other people's as well.
Yeah, and I know I did do some podcasts and some on other podcast episodes with other people where we specifically talked about historical materialism and even to a certain extent scientific socialism, where problems become very measurable. Like you can begin to measure them and you can begin to dissect things, not only with the language, but with the awareness of being able to pinpoint problems.
Yeah.
And like this conversation around, Marxism, Leninism, and my friend Rick has a really cool book coming out where he's highlighting how Marx and Lenin were having conversations around topics that pertain directly to decolonization. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like open up the conversation for people to begin to explore not only the theory aspect of it, but also the practical implications of applying it, right? And I wanted to hone in on that conversation for our listeners who are starting to ask these questions. I know we did have some conversations in the DMs with some of you out there, but to really like hit home, not only like the theory aspect, but also like the name of this podcast episode, like grounded reflections on it, like people mm-hmm. who have the experience of not only living in a world, obviously, you painting this picture of what your family's been through and what your lands have been through, but then also finding the tool and the theory to be able to navigate it, label it, and figure out what these problems are, and finding alternatives to problems mm-hmm. Through theory, but also through the reality that, hey, there's a problem here and it's measurable, basically.
Totally, yeah. And it's so important to note that the theory is based on the reality that you talk about, the material reality, and looking at it from a dialectic perspective. But essentially, it's looking at your reality and your conditions, and the more you analyze it, the more you realize all material. Very little of it is idealistic. It's very little of it is based on ideas or the concept of ideas. It's your reality and conditions based on materials. And when you have that understanding, when you're rooting everything in your material condition, then you look at power dynamics and more specifically, control of capital. And I think, and you touched on this a little bit around Marx, but more specifically, the fusion of Marxism, Leninism, and the October Revolution in Russia in 1917 were huge leap forwards in human political history in terms of galvanizing such large forces, not only military, but working class, and unifying millions and hundreds of millions of people around a common goal. And the Soviet Union, one of its the foundational bases and principles of its foreign policy and domestic, was very much in support of decolonized struggles or decolonial struggles ongoing. And it mm-hmm. wasn't necessary that whoever was like the country or state or group in question were like hardcore Marxist-Leninists, and they were like these theoretical know-it-alls, or their government was. It's the foundational or basis of their geopolitical or historical dynamics were inherently decolonial, and the Soviet Union, throughout the span of its life, supported almost every single one of those efforts, sometimes to its own detriment, and that's where Afghanistan comes in, but devoted all of its resources to anti-imperialist and anti-colonial struggles, and didn't hold it didn't have theoretical purity as a prerequisite mm-hmm. for its intervention by any means. So
yeah, and I love how you said that, because I feel like amongst like white leftists, white Marxists, in general, there is like this theoretical purity standard, and it bugs me because it's like these college, university educated settlers that grew up, for the most part, a pretty privileged life in terms of growing up in a settler state, having access to all the benefits of settler colonialism. And it's not necessarily coming from like the lived conditions or the lived history of oppression or the lived experience. And for me, the lived experience as being an indigenous person, living on their homeland in their territories under a settler colonial state. And that's really important to highlight. And I love how you highlighted that, is that like there is, for me, there's no expectation of people, knowing the theory in and out. If anything, I find that turns people away and turns people off to the point of where they will assume that the theory is inherently white people theory, or inherently the white college, university educated leftist theory. And it's not.
Yeah, that's kind of the basis around theoretical aspects of it. And I think some historical leaders have done such an incredible job of understanding theory and understanding that it's not something that's inherently academic, and have passed it on to hundreds of millions of people,
Totally.
such as Mao Zedong in China, after the success of the Chinese Revolution and the victory of the Chinese Revolution, being able to disseminate the theoretical basis of Marxism-Leninism and then Maoism to hundreds of millions of illiterate peasants, and them embodying it and embracing it and making it their own, and making it inherently a Chinese characteristic for their political system. And they've been flourishing ever since what, 60, 70, 80 years, completely different. One of the most successful examples of what socialism can do for quality of people's lives and their dignity and their well-being.
Yeah, I like it, and I feel like this conversation is going to open up to some of our listeners to really begin to look into it and dive more into it, because obviously, like we are labeled as a left-leaning podcast. Obviously, we had Marxists on, we had people who openly identified as communists on, and had some amazing, cool conversations, and this is adding to it. Like, I definitely want to add to this narrative and this flavor, and again, like rooting down and hitting home the reality that the problems we face are measurable. And I like how you said they're not necessarily rooted in academic theory, because I feel like Indigenous people, like my people, coming out of like the era of residential school, coming out of, the Indian Act era, the reservation system era, we tend to critique academic theory, rightfully so, but we make the assumption that a lot of, the alternative measures that we could take as a community are theoretical, when like you hit it home the reality, like historical materialism, it's based off the very real, measurable oppression that has been taking place. So there is some truth to this knowledge, right? So it's not just something we could push on the margins and be like, oh, that's Marxists from Russia or Germany and all these stuff, in these conversations, and Leninism, and they're all Europeans, which I really want to start to push back against, because no, like we definitely have, and then I always jokingly say, well, people who are the like, like neo-colonial entrepreneurs, like how come we're not questioning their theories? How come we're not questioning, their thought process as coming from Europe? But then when we bring to the table, Marxism, Leninism, and all these examples of that, we get critiqued harshly as like, oh, you're just reading white people theory. But it's like, what?
Well, they're exactly, so what? But in terms of observations of material conditions, that's inherently like an experiential, like a lived experience, if you will say. And I know, and there are critiques of that term, and I agree with some of the critiques of that term, but it's not difficult to measure your reality. You're living it, especially when we're talking about political oppression, but more specifically socioeconomic disparities. You're living it. And Marx and Lenin and Marx before him and other philosophers were not the first ones to observe this. It's not an idea they came up with. Yeah. It's a philosophy that they honed, that they wrote down and made super concise and honed. And it's a living, substantial contribution to that train of thought, and other people have built on it. But he wasn't the first one to think up of this of these terms and of these realities. They've been in recorded history, and he cites recorded history as the basis for these observations. So that's, I think, sometimes overlooked. And another aspect of it that and I think I've developed potentially more wording over the past 2 years and openly push back on is and the aspect of reading theories or works of white people. And this is where, when you go back to well, how are you approaching things? If you look at things based on identity and based on race and based where you come from, origins, which are important, but not the defining characteristics. It really depends on how you're approaching things, because Marxism and theoretical work related to it looks at things in a very simplistic way. And it doesn't have to be super complicated. You have the base and you have the superstructure. And the base has these dynamics they were talking about around capital, modes of production, relations of productions, what kind of class have come about that since we moved into a capitalist society globally after the Industrial Revolution. There is no that's something that's only occurring in Europe and didn't affect us. It's a global phenomenon. And because the global phenomenon is created global classes, and you have items and factors in the superstructure, and the base informs the superstructure. So even if you're looking at identity, nationality, race, these are all things that are real. I'm not dismissing them, obviously not as an Afghan person. It's something that I've actively experienced. But if you subscribe to this thought, then you will see how the base informs the superstructure. And based on that, I bring that up because once you have that understanding, or you pertain to that understanding and you relate to it, then you see that things are inherently class-based. And it doesn't matter if you're Indigenous or Black or a person of color, or if you live in Europe or you're white. If you're working class, your reality, obviously different dimensions, but same types of actors and ruling elite class are the ones who are subjugating everybody in very different ways, but it's the same actor. So then these conversations around, well, that person's white and his work is irrelevant to us, kind of become a moot point. And they are a moot point. That doesn't mean you can't use works from different people to not only advance your own liberation efforts, but add to it and use that as a basis to make it your own, the way China did with Marxism, Leninism, and then Maoism, and made inherently that theory their own and applied it to their living conditions and their material conditions. And they weren't opposed to that coming from the Russians. I mean, later they had their divergences with Soviet Union on a theoretical level, ironically, but inherently they still subscribe to that whole dynamic in philosophy as a whole. So I think we really need to push back on these because it's very divisive. It's supremely divisive. And I would argue it's one of the reasons in other parts of the world, especially parts of the world that are not global south, but specifically what is known as North America, why we don't have a consolidated and unified working class movement, because we get so bogged down in these unnecessarily divisive factors that not only are, I'm not saying it's something that's fed into by community members and as a whole, it's literally fed to us by academics, not only academics, but community leaders who subscribe to neoliberal thoughts, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, international governmental organizations, any charity, whatever you speak of, they hone in on these supremely ultra-liberal differences.
Yeah, they're liberals.
And supremely liberal, but coded as being progressive and anti-neoliberal. And it's a real malice and a real illness that North America, Canada and the US particularly, and the people in it suffer from. And it's why we don't have an inherent working class movement. And it's such a shame. And really, it really dissipates the work that and the progress that we have done, may have accomplished the past century and a half. And it's all been undone. And that's why the global south, you will see that when you inherently see the kind of solidarity that Venezuela has with Palestine and Iran and other parts of the world and Syria, and that's reciprocal to South America, they don't see it as, well, they're another part of the continent, or, oh, even there are other brown people necessarily. I'm oversimplifying it. They see it on a principle of, we have the same set of oppressors and anything else is a moot point. And I think it's a serious conversation we need to have amongst organizing circles here, and why we can't accomplish anything, quite frankly. And it's supremely sad.
Yeah, I love what you said, because part of the reason why I wanted you to have this conversation for Radical Narrative listeners is because I wanted to bypass I'm going to say it, but for lack of a better word in framing, because I have a brain for it right now, but the white leftists who position themselves as leftists in North America, because, me, Rick, Decolonize Buffalo, Plants Fanon, all these, the people who are pushing for leftist theory and approaches to the conversations, we really view that it's settler colonialism that shoots these people in the foot constantly because they're not addressing or failing to address the reality of settler colonialism in terms of Canada, in terms of the United States, where there is like this move like to replace the United States and Canada with more leftist frameworks, but then at the same time, it doesn't necessarily bring justice to displaced Indigenous peoples, doesn't necessarily bring justice to the world that have dealt with imperialism. So I wanted to bypass that and have you come on and highlight that problem, that this is the problem, that there is an inherently liberal aftertaste. Like there's a liberal vibe to everything in terms of justice conversations and solidarity and organizing. And it's very neoliberal on the Indigenous spectrum because everything's financial, everything's NGO, everything is legal now. There's really not much like active mobilizing and organizing of people, like grassroots people. Post I Don't Know More, like I Don't Know More was peak, but we saw reconciliation conversations come in and really promote this neoliberal conversation that is being co-opted by people who are, not open to this bigger conversation of striving for that alternative that you're speaking to through like a Marxist-Leninist approach.
And much of this is based off the conditions of us observing it. But the way you explained it, I feel like if there was a more unified front, if there was a more cohesive sense of understanding, I could trust that more. Like I feel like I could legitimately trust that more because, like you said, there is this dynamic unfolding in the Americas that literally does more of a disservice as opposed to creating a unification and an agreement on things. And I feel that is partly why I critique it so hard. Like I do critique white leftism very hard from my positionality and from my experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I really appreciate you honing on that even more and focusing on that. And I would go further and say, based on superstructure, like even settler colonialism is a manifestation of those relationships. So it's settler colonialism, or as framed here, and may look something very different in other parts of the world, but it's the ruling elite class, right? And not only white leftists, I would say anyone who, I'm going to focus very specifically on Canada, because I think the US has made more tangible strides towards having more principled groups and organizing circles, and have their own struggles, but it's not nearly as awful as Canada, quite frankly. And the organizing spaces that I have seen and observed, it's not, like I was saying, it's not only white leftists, it's anyone who dubs themselves to be leftist are inherently, what they subscribe to is very ultra-liberal doctrines, ultra-liberal political doctrines, and a lot of it's not only been corrupted by academia but actively pushed by it, and these spaces eat it up, and they present it to be as progressive, and it's degenerate, honestly. And the amount of disservice we've done to ourselves, in not only not progressing in what we want to do, but actively helping the ruling elite class divide us and inherently conquer us, that's on us. And the sooner we realize that these differences are inherently class-based and not necessarily based on identity, the sooner we'll be able to be a tangible threat and something that's a meaningful threat to the ruling elite class.
See, that I like it because not only are you talking about like the bark, right? Like, for lack of a better word, like the actual bark and conversation, but also the bite. Like, you're actually highlighting the need for action. You're actually highlighting the need for ultimately, liberation in my perspective, but also getting everybody's needs met and ultimately coming up with a better and more moral landscape, political landscape, social landscape. And I feel like you are correct to say that there's more work that needs to be done, obviously, and that the work that has been done hasn't necessarily been conducive to even pinpointing what the problem is, right? Or even unifying in terms of highlighting what the specific problem is.
Identifying who your enemy is, right? And in the different ways that they subjugate you, and the states, it looks different. But the reason why we're not taken seriously is because we're not a serious enough opposition to it. We don't threaten anything that they hold near and dear, and that's capital and resources and territory and control over that. So I want to share the blame across the board, because I think we all feed into it across the board. And I'm inherently somebody who doesn't think that someone has to be the same political view as me, especially theoretically. I don't want that, and I don't expect it. And there's a lot of infighting in those communities as well. But we need to have at least a common understanding of where is it that we want to go, and who is it that we're opposing, and what is it that we're opposing. And the sooner we stop feeding into culture wars based on identity, petty divergences, and personal grudges, the sooner we'll go around to bypassing a lot of these horrible, because I'm tired.
Yeah, there is a sense of like exhaustion, I feel, just in general, even just observing and even seeing how neoliberalism plays out time and time again. It's measurable. Yeah.
And I know a lot of other people are. And what ends up happening is people divest from these spaces because they see that it's absolute rubbish and nonsense. And I think comparatively, it's a much darker picture in Canada than in the States.
Yeah, and honestly, like I don't really have like a good comprehensive understanding of what's taking place on the left in terms of the United States, other than, you know, the mainstream podcast or Twitter sphere. But yeah, I would agree. I definitely would agree, because I always get like, I don't necessarily, as an Indigenous person, obviously first and foremost, right, believing in decolonization, Indigenous nationhood, definitely on point with saying, you know, Canada is the problem. You know, Canada is and has always been the problem. And this constant rebrand or breathing life into, you know, the settler state has been something that has completely like turned me away from, you know, certain political organizing or conversations with some people. And, you know, some of his position as harm reduction, or, you know, having to deal with things right now in this way. But the overall arching goal of creating the alternative where people's needs are met is something that I think does get overlooked in general. And even in particular in these conversations too, from like the treaty perspective, from like Indigenous people from treaty territory, like nation to nation agreements, right? So why is it obviously we're still being marginalized even in those conversations? Or why is it like, you know, this contradiction of how do we deal with Canada, how we deal with settler colonialism is often not necessarily the primary conversation. It is like the harm reduction approach, right? It's kind of like the conversation around, well, Canada's here to stay. In the meantime, let's do this, is the vibe I always get.
Sure. And so then the larger conversation is that's from like an inherently Indigenous perspective, right? So then how do we make this a conversation that applies to everybody, in the sense that it's a common goal everyone can strive towards? And that's what I mean when you need that like foundational understanding of something, or a foundational agreement to go off of something coming from different perspective. And that I think that's inherently where we fall short, as we don't have a unifying factor, because we don't look at things from a class perspective. We see it, this is where I'm coming from, and but I don't relate to you, so you don't necessarily understand where I'm coming from. So how can we potentially be a team? And we can't even wrap our mind around. I think we can wrap our minds around how divided we have been, because if you do think about it, it's very depressing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can get depressing, but I really appreciate your thoughts and perspectives and adding to the commentary and conversation, because there is a divide, right? There is a distrust. And that's the big word for me, is like, I personally don't trust certain people who are advocating for certain politics, but don't necessarily, you know, have a very, like you said, like a very concrete direction or project to invest in.
It's disappointing and alarming how codified it is. Not only in organizing spaces generally, but like any places, any conversations that talk about any semblance of a topic related to progressive topics. I have a comrade, I don't know if you know him actually online, his name is Marius Trotter, and he writes occasionally for Midwestern Marks. But he did a really nice piece, and I was able to speak to him about it at that, around intersectionality and the perils of woke liberalism, as he framed it. And it's one example around intersectionality being a principle that's now codified everywhere. Like it's the inherent principle that you start with, and you go from there in terms of how you talk about things. But when you delve into the topic in and of its own, it's relatively new. Early 2000s, late 90s, by Kimberly Crenshaw. And if you looked at some of the backing of that work in terms of not only funding, but support and academic legitimacy, it's folks who have done very similar work in other parts of the world in terms of sabotaging active administrations. And this includes NGOs, international NGOs. So it's a larger topic of we're now being fed these principles or these theories that are on the outside may look progressive, but are inherently anti-class and anti-working class, and alienates the majority of the working class people on this continent, in Canada and US in particular. But it's something that people swear by and will like break relations off based on it in terms of community organizing and how they affiliate with you and how they interact with you. And there's just no room for conversations or divergences at all. It's just, if you're not in the same principled stance of this one specific thing that I subscribe to, then you are anti so-and-so and so, and you get canceled right away. And you alienate so many working class folks who are not in these spaces. So even like the most ultra liberal circles are extremely exclusive and inherently cater to elite ruling class values and serve their purpose and agendas. And it's very disappointing for sure.
Yeah, and I really like how you highlighted the piece. I want to go read it. But it's like that's been my experience. Like I feel like when I do have these conversations, definitely push to the margins because like my perspective or my, indigenous reality in terms of looking at, my material conditions and even adding to the theory is not taken seriously, right? And I feel like in the Americas, it's really important for this to be remedied, to have, again, like you highlighted, like a unified consensus on a general direction and project. And I feel like in the last like 5 to 8 years in my observations that how you're highlighting like the ruling class, they are being asserted, like they are being uplifted, like neoliberalism is the name of the game. And the trajectory is constantly breathing life into systems of funding and systems of ultimately oppression that don't necessarily meet the needs of people. And I like it. I really like what you're saying, the picture you're painting, because I do know that leftists in general do listen to the radical narrative. Settler leftists, white leftists in general do listen. So it's food for thought. And for people who are making their way to the conversation for the first time, this is why like class consciousness is important. This is why having these conversations is important. This is why historical materialism is important, understanding these things and really measuring the world we're living in from a critical lens in general, right? And having that autonomy and that ability to navigate it and have that backbone to navigate it.
For sure.
I think it's really important. It's really important. And you're demonstrating that. You definitely are demonstrating that. And I think you did highlight like some of the questions I did want to ask in the conversation we just had. I think you answered all of question number 9, like all these questions I had for you.
Yeah, I'd go further in terms of what you're saying and also add that these factors and just different topics we're talking about also will go a very long way in helping everyone understand why things are happening in the world right now in real time. And the more you explore these topics and different actors in it and just different dynamics, you are inevitably going to delve into the history of those things. And the further back you delve into it, the more concrete you will see like what we're speaking about in terms of things being based on class is very stark. And it's very obvious and in your face because, as I was saying, it's a global phenomenon. Like ever since we transitioned from a feudal system into a capitalist system of society, through the Industrial Revolution, this is our reality. And this is why Lenin says that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. And to go even further, Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana says that neocolonialism is the highest stage of imperialism. And you will see that things that apply to you very specifically, that you're very passionate about, is all interconnected and more than just one ways of overall being oppressed. It's inherently class-based and based on capital and based on resource monopoly. And the sooner we kind of somewhat, very even loosely understand this reality, the sooner we'll be able to help bring about the transition to a multipolar state of reality in the world. And we'll better understand the dynamics of what's happening in Ukraine with regards to Ukraine and why Russia has taken the positionality it has in regards to that. And we'll understand what's happening in Palestine and how it's not an isolated event. It predates even 1948, but also how that relates to imperialism and different histories of the world. And yeah, it's a whole new world.
It is. It really is. And I think like the reality too that we're starting to see in like the Indigenous world in Canada in particular is that we are seeing like the emergence of a very clear class divide starting to come out, where it's financially measurable that, you know, certain classes emerged in the reconciliation era, certain classes emerged in the last, 25 years of the Aboriginal industry where, people are making money off the neoliberal relationship. And this is where I think class consciousness and understand, not only the theoretical aspect of it, but measuring it and be more critical of it and outspoken of it is something that needs to happen. And in my opinion, is going to happen. Like people are going to connect these dots because we are seeing like a major, where we're starting to see the emergence of a class divide, which is becoming more apparent. It's becoming wider than a cultural divide. It's becoming wider than a land-based relationship divide. That, there are people who are benefiting from capitalism and neoliberalism and colonialism in Canada. That is really a major hindrance.
Totally. And I think you point to a very important aspect of Marxist theory is that all of these things are dialectic contradictions, right? And so the state of being is not stable. It's not going to be static. It's going to reach that precipice that you're mentioning where things boil over and spill over and something will materialize. That's what history has shown us. And I agree with regards to that being more apparent here now. Perhaps not quick enough, but I think with some of the global developments and some of the other awakenings that we see, even politically on a smaller scale, has been very impressive. And we can only hope that, these contradictions become apparent enough and stark enough that people mobilize around that specific factor. And that's the hope. And while we aren't there yet, and we need to not only actively work towards it, but also help understand, not only understand, but help with regards to some of the other parts of the world that are actively implement that and not sabotage it and not take sides or stances that are actively in opposition to that. And that's why perhaps I'm a bit more wary and pessimistic of where we are, is because we actively take stances that are in opposition to peoples, groups, and states that have reached that precipice of contradictions and are actively working to overthrow it or manipulate it and transform it to something else, and we're in opposition to it. A lot of it has to do with being part of the imperial core, but a huge part of it is that we don't have an inherent working class movement here. So we can't relate. There's nothing for us to relate to them aside from identity, and not everyone obviously shares that factor with different parts of the world. For sure.
So in the greater scheme of things, how would this momentum pertain, obviously, to the greater world? Like you mentioned the imperial core, you mentioned, obviously Indigenous people being here, settler colonialism being an ongoing thing. The lack of this core mobilization that isn't taking place amongst the working class. So what's the picture, or like the theoretical, I guess like a theoretical framework, or the picture that you hope to see, or the shifts you need to see happen, that you want to see happen?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I want to see happen. I'm not sure in terms of how that would come about. I think we have a very it's a supremely uphill battle. If we can relate to some of the developments unfolding in the world right now, in Palestine and Middle East and South Asia and South America, even on a very, let's say, like surface level, let's say like you're you oppose violence and war. That's fantastic. That's a stepping stone and a starting stone in terms of delving into those histories, understanding how it relates to us and your daily life, how it impacts you, how it impacts your socioeconomic status, how dollars that you may be contributing to these systems. Particularly, the Canadian government is notorious for establishing groups like the Lema Group in opposition to Venezuela, a huge role in funding the government in Kiev and its fascist nature and in support of NATO. These are all dollars that can go towards betterments of our life, towards the betterment of our life. We see how prices have in fact impacted our lives on the daily, inflation, and how it impacts you directly. And if you can even relate to it on that basis, that's a huge stepping stone in terms of understanding things on a more global scale. And, that's kind of where you'll get started in terms of learning new things and understanding that a lot of these struggles are at home first and foremost. And we deserve to live a dignified life. We deserve to have well-being in our lives. We deserve to be present, and we deserve to thrive. And that only happens when we hold our government accountable. And once you hold this government accountable, you're directly threatening the ruling elite class. And that's how you can tangibly, very materially change things at home. But for that to happen, there needs to be a unified understanding of, hey, how is this benefiting us? It's not. Well, what can we do? And what kind of power do we hold as an individual, but more so as a community? And how can we leverage that? That's the best case scenario that I see. And from there, hopefully, we'll have more solidarity with other parts of the world and in their struggles, particularly in the global south, and support the emergence of a multipolar world that gets rid of U.S. imperialism and the hegemony of the petrodollar. Because that's inherently the biggest contradiction that's impacting all of us. It's not necessarily your class. That's part of it. But the biggest contradiction, because Lenin did say imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, is U.S. imperialism. So how do we mobilize in efforts to dismantle that? If we can't, who is doing the best that they can, and how can we support them?
Yeah, and it's a valid perspective. It definitely is a valid perspective in context to everything we talked about. And for a lot of people, I think this is going to be a new conversation. And obviously we build on this conversation, and like even me and, my friends and people in the same political spectrum definitely, add to this conversation in unique ways. But you gave us a lot. You gave us a lot to think about, and it's a big cookie to eat. There's a lot of information there.
It is. I was like, oh, what did I not say last time that I was beating I was listening to it and I was like, I beat around the bush around this topic. I wish I could have been a little more upfront. So I feel very validated, vindicated.
Yeah. We definitely want to make space for you to say what you wanted to say and needed to say.
Oh, it wasn't you, it was me. I was holding back. I wasn't sure how much I could push.
Well, this time around, I think you're saying what you want to say, need to say. And yeah, there's a lot of food for thought here. And again, I really appreciate the political conversations. We really wanted to have someone demonstrate that isn't necessarily coming from the white North American leftist conversation, or the conversation that is inherently tied to certain neoliberal approaches that are pretty problematic for people, in particular Indigenous people. But we really appreciate you being the voice and speaking to this.
No, yeah, my pleasure. I always get so excited when you ask me to be on here. Yeah, I'm never gonna say no.
Cool. Yeah, and anything else you want to add? Anything else you want to discuss or talk about?
No, anything on your front that I haven't answered? Or anything you want to?
One key question I do ask people in general is, what resources or what books, what recommends do you give people to begin to build their critical consciousness, get those brain gains, and think critically about the world?
There are two works that I think are fundamental onto understanding, because I know you and I kind of delved into it a little bit, but we were talking about it as something that's inherent knowledge, and it's not. But I think things that are books and resources that are really helpful in breaking down some of the terms that we use that are foundational to, if you are interested in learning more about historical materialism, dialectical materialism, and just Marxist theory as a whole, is The Principles of Communism by Engels. People always think they have to read Das Kapital by Marx, which is 10,000 pages long to understand theory, and it's not. Marx and Engels were they co-developed the theory, right? But Engels' work called Principles of Communism is very short, it's very succinct, and it paints a whole picture of what historical materialism is. And then Stalin's work called Dialectical Materialism and Historical Materialism breaks it out even further. And he wrote at the time where it was post-October Revolution, and something that the Soviet Union, that work was foundational to their approach of how they governed themselves and also their foreign policy approaches. But it really breaks those theoretical terms down very succinctly, and also goes through the different cyclical like modes of society we've gone through, from like primitive communalism to feudalism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism, and then hopefully socialism. And it breaks down that picture, and hopefully it sheds light on some of the similarities around different things that we've been talking about. But those are two foundational work theoretically. There's also, of course, Lenin's works, but they're longer. So those two ones are like fundamental.
Yeah, it's a good reference, and it's interesting too, because there is a relationship to indigenous people in a very weird way to some of the core theories with Engels and Marx, in particular around them using Lewis Henry Morgan's work. They were citing him, and he was like a early anthropologist in North America, and was like a LARPer, like pretending to be native and did weird dances. But he had a legitimate relationship with Eli Parker, a Seneca lawyer, who's legitimately indigenous with legitimate ties to indigenous community. And Morgan was basically like mining him for information and writing and publishing work that was sourced to Eli Parker, and ultimately getting it wrong, like, writing things wrong, right? So like the implication here is like, what if Eli Parker wrote and published and explained things better, and then became the citation for Marx, or was the citation, for Engels? And of course, some people have some very real good critiques of Engels, but it would likely have been, there would be a very clear relationship to the political thought today with indigenous people in North America that is a little bit more closer than home than some would don't realize.
That's I think a general we need to have around putting anybody, any figure, any theory on a pedestal. They're meant to be references, right? So even if, like, for example, what you're citing, of course, Marx and Engels may have cited what was best known by somebody who may have the most experience collectively of observations of a particular part of the world, and debasing that and making an argument, right? So the conversation that becomes murky is like, well, because they reference something that's inaccurate, does that make this whatever they've produced credible? And I would argue still yes. You still need to look at the merits of what they've produced, even though, of course, what the references are inaccurate. But it's a larger conversation of, you can't put anybody or any theory, any figure, any country on a pedestal. And I think people need to realize that, including a lot of communists and Marxists who, as someone who loves the Soviet Union, over-glorify the Soviet Union and China as well. And I always bring this up because they've made incredible mistakes. And I think Soviet Union has been more accountable than China, and China is trying its best too. But have done incredible service to their people and the region and the globe at large, but are still flawed. And I've heard that before, that reference in Marx's work, especially around framing of indigenous peoples, right? And I think the wording was primitive, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. There's critiques of that, and you are correct to say, like, humans are fallible. Like, we make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. Nothing's perfect, right? But yeah, like, not disregarding or throwing away the theory or the work, and taking into account the reality of the conditions that the work was looking at.
Because inherently, everything that they argue for in terms of base and critique of capital and critique of property and critique of modes of production and relation, that's still all accurate. So it's more like, well, yeah, he didn't use the perfect wording. And honestly, I'm like, well, so what? It was the 19th century. That's the most information they had. On that basis, what's important is not so what isn't being insensitive. It's like, so what? Well, what are you going to go from here? How are you going to build it towards what you're trying to do? So if you're going to nitpick and critique everything, you will have nothing left. And I think it's so also indicative of cancel culture at present. And but also going with, you can't put anybody on a pedestal. That's foolish. everyone is human, and because they're human, their byproducts, whether that be theory, their legacy of historically, politically, is also going to be flawed. You can't defend them to the end of the world. It's more like your defense of them or your adherence to them. What does that produce? And I think that's the larger picture. And also indicative of the culture wars that we get bogged down on. It's like, okay, really? This is going to be your argument?
Yeah, the theoretical wars. But while we're talking about writing, you wrote a piece recently.
I did. I wrote something for the team at Midwestern Marks were kind enough to let me make a submission around Venezuela. So recently there's been inflamed talks about Essequibo, which is a territory that's claimed by Guyana, but is traditionally historically Venezuelan territory. After Venezuela gained statehood after Simón Bolívar's huge campaign in the independence of Gran Colombia in South America. But recently there have been imperialist ventures in Essequibo around resources, particularly petrol and oil resources that is rightfully Venezuela. So it's just a historical kind of recounting of why Venezuela is legitimate in the stance it's taking, because people are calling it Venezuelan imperialism when it's not. And why we shouldn't be so quick to jump on things without understanding even the recent history of Venezuela and Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution and the service that it has done for the continent.
Nice. Yeah. We'll link it in the show notes.
Thanks for that shout out.
We'll link it in the show notes for sure. Yeah. One question I wanted to ask you is we're recording this on technically Christmas Eve, right? And I think that one of the earlier questions was to give context to, are you celebrating Christmas?
No, and that was like, whoa, was it the 23rd already? It's not something we adhere to on a spiritual or faith level, but also even like it was never a tradition in our household, so we don't observe.
Yeah. Yeah, I forgot to throw that. I wanted to throw that into the beginning and it completely slipped my mind, and I remember reading it, that I didn't ask it. So I want to give that context because we're obviously...
But I love this time of the year.
Well, I was going to say like it was hard to narrow down some podcast episodes, right? Because everyone's doing the Christmas thing. And then Liam's like, oh yeah, I'm on holidays.
I always forget about it because I don't celebrate. I'm like, oh yeah, you have things to do. It's Christmas.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, we definitely, like, every year we say we want to have episodes around the conversations around Christmas, but at the same time, it's like, it's so busy. No one actually...
Christmas though, yeah.
It's like everyone's doing something. So it's been really, like, challenging to get those episodes out there. And I think I'm, like, making a note to try and do them, like, in early December or even in November even. That way they're, like, ready to go. But yeah, thanks for your time. Thanks for visiting me. And
you're welcome.
Yeah, it's always amazing to sit with you.
Yeah, of course. You take care.